Hurry! Get another piece of wood, Julia snapped, still shivering beneath several layers of clothes and blankets. Calm down, sweetheart. The fire's still going strong, John replied, though his voice was softer than he intended. We don't know how long this blackout will last, so we need to conserve the wood. Says the guy who's fine in a tank top, even in a snowstorm, she shot back, her teeth chattering despite her efforts to curl deeper into the blankets. John couldn't help but chuckle, though his concern for her was growing. I've survived worse, trust me, he said, his tone a bit firmer. I know how to handle this. But his words seemed to have little effect. Julia, his girlfriend of 9 months, hugged herself tighter, her gaze distant as though she were still trapped in the cold. It wasn't just the chill in the air, it was everything about the night, the unexpected storm and the power outage that had shifted the mood between them. He gave her the bulk of the blankets and made sure she was sitting directly in front of the fireplace, but it didn't seem to make a difference. His thoughts were consumed by her discomfort, and he couldn't focus on the cold that bit at his own skin. This wasn't how he'd imagined their evening. 3 hours ago, Julia had come home from her long shift at the hospital, and John had been ready cooking salmon with a side of sweet potatoes, her favorite meal. The plan had been perfect, a quiet, cozy night together. Then the power had gone out, and the blizzard had rolled in, and all his carefully laid plans dissolved in the darkness. John had grown up in Montana, surrounded by blizzards and harsh winters. He knew how to deal with cold. But Julia, raised in Miami, was a stranger to snow and freezing temperatures. The thick layers of clothing she wore just to drive to work seemed to echo that. This was her first major snowstorm, and it was clear she wasn't handling it well. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her, and she still shivered uncontrollably. He reached for her hand, his fingers grazing her wrist before gently pulling her close to him. Hey, he murmured, trying to soften his tone. You're not alone, okay? Julia turned toward him, her lips trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper. She looked vulnerable, like the weight of the unfamiliar had made her pull away from him. She had always been the strong one, the one who'd never needed anyone. But tonight, she looked small. John's heart ached for her, the realization that she was feeling more isolated than she ever had before. And in a way, it made the contrast of their backgrounds feel more pronounced. He was used to this, and she wasn't. He could see the stress in her eyes as she tried to pull herself together, and it made him ache with a desire to make everything okay again. He wanted to fix it, to make her feel safe, but it was as if the distance between them was growing with every shiver that ran through her. Still, he tried to stay focused. Let me make it up to you, okay? We'll figure this out. Julia met his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering warmth of the fire. There was something unspoken between them, something that hung heavy in the air. She didn't say anything at first, just nodded, her fingers lingering on his for a moment longer than necessary. John held her gaze, but the silence between them stretched long, thick, filled with a tension that he couldn't quite name. It was more than just the cold. More than just the blackout. It was the way she was pulling away without realizing it. And yet, despite the tension, he couldn't help but feel a pull toward her, an urgency to close the distance. They were tangled in the warmth of the fire, but the gap between their hearts felt far colder than the storm outside. My God, how does anyone live through this? Julia groaned, her breath visible in the cold air. She shifted restlessly, her layers of clothing barely keeping the shivers at bay. I knew I'd have to adjust when I transferred here last spring, but not like this. John tightened his arms around her, his chest pressing against her back, his body heat a small comfort against the chill. You get used to it, he murmured, his voice low and steady, trying to keep her calm. Julia let out a dry laugh, but it was faint, a little hollow. Not soon enough for a Miami girl. Hell, I didn't even see snow for the first time until I was 22. John chuckled softly, his lips brushing the side of her neck as he spoke. I admit, the novelty wears off fast. But eventually you kind of harden to it. You even start to appreciate it. Julia's voice softened, the tension in her words giving way to something warmer, though her discomfort still lingered. No offense to your hometown in Connecticut, but I'd rather be wearing my bikini on South Beach right about now. John smirked, the corners of his mouth tugging upward. None taken. If it helps, I'll go grab your bikini from the closet, and we can pretend we're on South Beach. Julia's lips quirked into a reluctant smile, but it faded almost immediately as her teeth chattered. I appreciate the sentiment, John, but I'd rather focus on surviving. There's only so much pretending I can do when I'm freezing. John sighed, his fingers sliding beneath the blanket to find her skin. His touch was light, almost tentative, but it was enough to draw a shiver from her, not from the cold, but something else. Her body reacted to him, even in the midst of the discomfort. He pulled her a little closer, his body enveloping hers, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade. The cold, the storm outside, even the power outage, none of it mattered as much as the warmth between them, the way their bodies naturally sought each other. His lips brushed against her ear as he spoke again, his voice softer, more intimate now. "Julia," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "I've got you. We'll get through this. Together." Her breath caught, a shiver running through her, not from the cold, but from the way his voice, his touch, made her feel. She turned her face toward him, her eyes meeting his, something unspoken passing between them. The tension that had lingered in the room shifted, deepening, thickening with every moment they held each other. John's fingers trailed slowly down her arm, the touch lingering just a little longer than necessary. Julia's breath caught in her chest, and the space between them seemed to shrink even further. He felt her pulse quicken under his fingertips, and his own heart began to race, syncing with hers. He shifted slightly, his lips brushing against the soft curve of her jaw. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know," he said, his words quiet but filled with a quiet intensity. Julia's breath was shallow as she turned to face him, her lips so close to his that he could feel the warmth of them. "I'm not pretending," she whispered, her voice a little shaky. Her hands moved to his chest, sliding beneath his shirt, fingers tracing the contours of his muscles. Her touch was light but purposeful, as though she was trying to memorize the feelings. John's hand slid down her back, pulling her closer until their bodies were pressed against each other, the heat between them undeniable. He felt the tension that had built between them melt away, replaced by something deeper, something that made the world outside the snow, the blackout, feel distant, almost irrelevant. He kissed her then, slow and deliberate, a kiss that spoke of everything they hadn't said yet, of the way their chemistry had always been undeniable, but now felt almost inevitable. Her lips were soft beneath his, and she kissed him back with a hunger he hadn't expected, one that matched his own. Her hands slid up to his neck, pulling him closer, and he responded in kind, his hands sliding under her layers, needing to feel her skin against his. The coldness of the room seemed to disappear with every touch, every kiss, until all that was left was the heat of their bodies pressed together. Julia's breath was uneven now, her hands grasping at him as though she were desperate for something more, something beyond the cold that had held her in its grip. John pulled back slightly, his eyes dark with desire. "We don't have to rush this," he murmured, his voice rough, the control he'd always prided himself on slipping just a little. She shook her head, her eyes locking with his. "I don't want to wait," she whispered, and the way she said it low, soft, filled with need was all the invitation he needed. John kissed her again, this time deeper, the urgency of the moment taking over. There was no room for hesitation now. The storm outside, the blackout, everything else faded into the background as they lost themselves in each other. "That's not the point," Julia muttered, her voice laced with frustration. "What bugs me is that I've been through tough situations before, blackouts, disasters, even a meningitis outbreak at the hospital. I've always found a way to endure, adapt, and stay strong. But now, in this storm, with all this cold, I feel so damn pathetic." John's eyes softened as he pulled her closer, her warmth against him with comfort. "Why? There's only so much you can do in a blizzard-induced blackout." "I know. Damn it," she snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. I just feel like I'm better than this, especially when I'm with the man I love. His breath caught, his heart missing a beat. Her words, raw and unguarded, pierced through the storm. Julia had said, "I love you," before, but it had always been playful, casual, almost as if testing the waters. But this time, there was no doubt. It was real, heartfelt, and she was showing him just how much. For a moment, he forgot about the cold, the dark, everything except her. His gaze locked onto hers, the intensity of the moment making the room feel smaller, hotter. He wasn't sure if she understood the gravity of what she'd just said. For all he knew, the cold had affected her mind, but something told him that this was more than a fleeting admission. It was something deeper, something real. And he knew, in that instant, he had to show her just how much he loved her. His arms wrapped around her tightly, his lips grazing her ear as he whispered, "You are better, Julia. Better than anyone I know." She met his gaze, her expression softening just slightly. "That's sweet of you, John, but it doesn't make me feel any less pathetic." "No," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her jawline. "Frustration and helplessness aren't the same thing. Helpless means there's nothing left to give. Frustration is just needing to push a little harder than you thought you could." She looked up at him, still shivering but now feeling the heat between them. "The power's still out, the heater's broken, and we're almost out of food. How are we not helpless?" John's lips curled into a teasing smile, his eyes gleaming. "There's one option we haven't tried yet," he said, his voice low with a mix of mystery and desire. "One I didn't think would be appropriate. But now, I think it's exactly what we need." Julia arched an eyebrow, her body instinctively leaning closer. "Oh! And what might that be?" John's grin turned devilish, and without another word, he let go of her. He moved toward the firewood rack, his movements purposeful, almost deliberate. He picked up a large piece of wood, mindful of the time it would burn, but his mind was elsewhere on her, on the heat building between them. He set the wood on the fire, letting it crackle for a moment. Then, slowly, he turned back to face her, his eyes darkening with intent. He shed his shirt, letting it fall to the floor, then followed by his pants. The moment he was left in nothing but his black boxers, he felt the tension in the air crackle, the temperature rising between them. Julia's breath hitched as she watched him, her eyes widening. "John," she said, voice low, a mix of confusion and something else, something more electric. "As much as I love watching you flex those muscles of yours, I'm still inclined to point out that this is insane." John smiled, his gaze never leaving hers. He stood tall before her, completely at ease. "I know," he replied, voice thick with desire. "I'm willing to risk it. That's what a man does for the woman he loves." Her lips parted as she took in his words, the heat between them escalating. It was as if everything she'd been holding back, her doubts, her frustrations, began to melt away. The storm outside wasn't the only thing raging anymore. The room felt alive with a magnetic pull, drawing them together. Her eyes slid down his body, taking in every inch of him. He saw the fire ignite in her gaze, the same fire that mirrored his own. The air thickened with tension, every heartbeat echoing louder than the wind outside. John felt the ache of desire deepen inside him as she gazed at him, and he knew, without a doubt, this moment was theirs. No distractions, no more cold. Just the two of them, craving something more than just warmth. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his hands reaching her. His touch was slow but purposeful, fingers grazing her skin, testing the waters of her desire. He wanted her to feel this connection, to understand that this was more than just survival. This was about passion, trust, and the raw intensity of the moment. "Stop me if my timing is off, or if my idea is too forward," he murmured, his voice low and full of intent. "From where I'm sitting, it's looking less foolish with every word," Julia responded, her tone laced with desire.